Welcome back to another episode of the Freedom Shots podcast. I'm so excited today to welcome Isaac Willour. He is a contributor and commentator with Young Voices, just like I am. And in his real job, he is a corporate analyst with Bowyer Research. And he studies DEI and wokeness, and in his day job, he helps companies get away from some of these woke and DEI policies. So he is definitely a subject matter expert. This is one of the hottest topics that we are seeing in the news today. So stay tuned to hear from Isaac. If you're new here, my name is Victoria Snissar Churchill. I'm a conservative journalist and commentator based in the Washington, D.C. area. And this is my solo project where I come and chat with some of my great friends and other interesting people. So stay tuned for more of that. Isaac, thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much for all of the work that you've been doing on this. I have loved reading it. I know you've been covering this for a while. I think probably close to like a year and a half or 2 years now. So first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this kind of as your subject matter of expertise.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Obviously, it's a pleasure. Let's see, how did I get into this? So I graduated college May of last year. It feels like it's been 11,000 years since then, probably because like 11,000 years worth of political things have happened in the space in the intervening time period. But how did I get into this? Well, so when I was about to graduate college, my plan was to go be a journalist, right? I was going to go work at some outlet. I was fielding offers from a couple different places. And I decided this sounds really great, given that you're now a journalist. This is a great outlook to have. I decided that I just didn't want to do that. It just wasn't for me. There were things happening in my life that I wanted a career that had more stability. This is great. We're just going to talk about how bad journalism is to kick things off. I wanted a career with more stability. I wanted a career that was a little bit less it's funny. I wanted a career that changed that was going to change less depending on who was politically in power at the time. Clearly, that ended up somewhat not being the case, although in a sense it somewhat did. So I graduated from Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, and with a degree in political science, which is not a science, but it is what it is. So I went to work for Bowyer Research in Pittsburgh, which is what's known as a corporate engagement firm. What is corporate engagement? Well, we work with clients ranging from like mom and pop investors, normal retail investors, to institutional investors, nonprofits, that sort of thing. We work with these clients who are shareholders of major American companies to help them do a couple of things, right? So we help them talk to corporate executives, talk to investor relations at publicly traded companies to talk about and get concessions on walkbacks of biased corporate policies, right? Partisan aspects of corporate policy and practice. That's the majority of what we do. We also handle proxy voting, which is a very niche financial thing, which we could talk about if you'd like, but it's a little bit more in the weeds in terms of actually technically how investors' shares are stewarded in the context of a lot of resolutions about environmental, social, and corporate governance issues, which is where the term ESG comes from. We deal with that. And then on top of that, I also write about ESG, write about DEI in the media, which has been, as of late, a very, very, as you said, a very, very hot topic. And I really, maybe this is a place to start. I don't know if it's going to become more or less of a hot topic in the intervening maybe 4 years or so. Because part of me wants to say, well, because of executive orders, because just the natural way that big businesses tilt post Trump inauguration, right, which is the space in which we're in now, maybe it'll become less of a hot topic. But somehow I think there's going to be, if that happens, it's going to be a real bell curve, right? In the sense of it's going to continue to get very, very popular, very, very hot button, very controversial for a year or two, and then maybe something new will catch an edge with the public imagination. But I think the hubbub around ESG and DEI is going to continue for a while, and then maybe die down as something else catches the public's eye and the zeitgeist changes. But I don't know when it comes to, because there is something to be said about when a new presidential administration comes in, and especially an administration that campaigned very heavily on certain issues. Those issues, if those issues are meaningful, if meaningful progress is made, those issues sometimes tend to drop out of public imagination, right? This happened with was this would have happened with racial issues if it weren't for BLM, right? When when Obama came to presidency, right? At least the racial issues, it didn't get sidelined, but there were a lot of other things that also made its way into the cultural milieu because as much as national politics has changed the way we look at the extent to which we pay attention to politics, right? The way in which it's not an every 4 years you kind of care about politics because there's an election, right? The Olympics model. It's the I care about all things that are happening across America all the time. As much as that model has changed, there is going to be a decrease in like very niche interest in political machinations as we get into that period in between presidential elections. But that was a very long, rambling answer to I talk to big companies about their biased corporate policies for a living, and I also write on the side.
Love it. And like I said, big fan of the work that you do. It's always a joy
Thank
to
you.
watch and see all your hot takes and mic drop moments and all that
Oh,
good
we'll
stuff
get
that
plenty
you
of
love
those
to,
today,
yeah,
probably.
yeah, yeah, all those good things that you love to sprinkle in there. But kind of my first question for you is kind of in this new post 2024 election era, to what and like here's some recent headlines that I've seen, right? Costco's doing away with their DEI, Walmart is, and in the first few days of the Trump presidency, Trump has basically from the executive said that he wants to get rid of all DEI. Now, to what do you think Trump is kind of a symptom? And I guess, like going back, how long do you think DEI has really been a thing in the cultural zeitgeist? Because in my view, I think it really started with the first Trump campaign or around that time. And this is kind of one of those things where we talk about like culture and politics being intermixed and interchange. And, we always say politics is downstream from culture. And it's like, well, is it, or is culture downstream from politics? So kind of how would you say like what is kind of the origin story of this movement? And then kind of when we tackle that, then I think we can talk about how it's going to end or how it's going to change or how it is ending or how it is changing.
Sure, yeah. So let's see where to start with that to unpack that question. I think you can trace DEI back to the first Trump presidency. I think that's totally valid. I would say maybe in terms of the thing that all Gen Zers love, vibes, right? I think you can trace it back further than that. At the very least, I think you can trace it back to the Obama presidency because the Obama presidency was one that was it was a presidency that was won on the back of a lot of racial narratives, right? The idea of the first black president, that this was a monumental step in America's fight against racism, which is a real fight and was a real victory. And right now, both of the extremes of our political spectrum are actually about those two things, right? It was a real fight, but also was a real victory. And if you deny either one of those things, that's where you kind of springboard off into radicalism. The Obama presidency, I think, for a lot of people, especially a lot of conservatives, cemented this idea that talking about race in America is connected with some very toxic ideas about guilt, about class guilt, and not in terms of socioeconomic class, in terms of racial class, right? The idea of white guilt, right? Talking about racial issues in America has to involve someone's got to pay now, and when we, even in the context of having the conversation, we have to acknowledge that those dynamics supposedly still exist, although there's questionable whether that's true or not. So I think in terms of where the dialogue on race in America is toxified, I mean, it's always been toxic. I mean, you go back to the 1700s, it wasn't exactly better. You go back to the 1800s, it certainly wasn't better. The 1960s, I mean, every race debate was toxic, right? People had fire hoses pulled on them. So I think our debate over race in America has always been very difficult. I think conservatives in particular, because of our focus on defending systems, right, as opposed to pointing out the holes in those systems, which is something that Jonathan Haidt discusses, right? People who are conservative are more temperamentally inclined to support systems, tout the benefit of systems, that sort of thing. Whereas people who are liberal are temperamentally more likely to see holes in those systems and point out exceptions. I think that has led conservatives in a lot of good ways, right? I think it's led us to reject the current outgrowth of DEI, which is good. But I think historically, it's also made us a lot of notable conservatives, including William F. Buckley, people like that, were very slow on the civil rights movement, very slow on the front of race reconciliation. I've written a lot about this at places like the Acton Institute, right? This was a shift that happened in the 20th century, right? And it was the outgrowth of things that happened before the 20th century. So I think our dialogue on race has always been toxic. I think within the current context, and I speak with the bias that I'm 23 years old, right? So the Obama presidency was like the first thing I like even remotely cogently remember. The Obama presidency started this. The Trump presidency, because it was in many ways the backlash to the Obama presidency, as many presidencies are, definitely ratcheted up the tone and heat of that debate. 2020 happened. So within DEI as an entire philosophical construct obviously predates all these things, but DEI in terms of the corporate space definitely spiked up after 2020 and after the unfortunate death of George Floyd, right? So after the death of George Floyd, corporate America, I think the Fortune 250 sinks. Oh man, I had a count on this in a Daily Wire piece I wrote, but I want to say it was somewhere along the lines of $300 billion, where they pledged
Wow. Insane.
$300 billion to
Wow. Yeah.
programs designed to rectify racial issues, fix systemic racism, make everybody happy and not racist anymore, something along those lines, right? So when that happened, there's there's a real problem when it comes to trying to take ideals and actually apply them to systems that can live out those ideals, right? And that's true of everything. But I think after George Floyd, a lot of people just had this idea that was there's this idea kind of out there in the ether that okay, there's clearly some lasting wounds of some kind along racial issues in America, whether that's related to actual systemic existing inequalities or whether that's just due to just a lot of resentment and anger and feelings of disenfranchisement. That's up for debate, but it's there, right? And so we should, because we're Americans, we should be trying to rectify that. We should be trying to reconcile that issue, right? And I think out of that impulse, which is a noble impulse and an intention which is good, the move to practicalize it is was hijacked by a lot of people like Ibram Kendi, like Robin DiAngelo, who are not exactly the most stellar example of Americans being for all Americans. So I think a lot of DEI things, right? I have this debate with people a lot, right? People say that everyone who supports DEI programs does so because they're racist against white men or something. I don't think that's true, quite frankly. I think most people have who are very pro DEI have very noble intentions and legitimately believe that these programs help people. I know because I've talked to them and that's what they tell me. But I think the application's wrong. And so I think there's always been a lot of controversy about race in America. DEI and the backlash to DEI, which we're seeing now, is just the latest amalgamation of that. Doesn't make America more racially unified. I mean, if you look at the polls where it tracks how many people have said we've made no racial progress since 1963, I wouldn't exactly describe that as super unified. But in terms of the actual ability to root out discriminatory programs, whether that's from academia or corporate America or elsewhere, to the extent that DEI promulgates that, I think we're on a somewhat positive trend.
So that kind of brings me to my next question was, were we actually moving forward in a positive direction before DEI? Because kind of the way that I see DEI is that it was like this mandate for equality, right? But even you look at, again, kind of the contrast between politics and culture, in politics, in the 2016 campaign, we had Bobby Jindal, governor of Louisiana, running for president, right, who was a non-white governor of a southern state. We had Nikki Haley appointed to the Trump administration, who was also a former governor of South Carolina, a non-white governor of a southern state. In Virginia, right now we have a Republican. Winsome Sears obviously is our lieutenant governor. She's my lieutenant governor. Love following all the work that she does. But the way that I watched their campaigns, at least from what I saw, is they moved forward past this narrative of like, my upbringing and my background is what it is, but today I'm an American. I'm an American with this background. I'm an American with this skin color, but my campaign is about being an American, or my campaign is about being a South Carolinian, or being a Louisianan, or being a Virginian. And it seems like, with people like Tim Scott, I think there was a headline a few days ago that was like, he's the longest serving black senator now. And it's like, well, he is, but that's not the narrative that he spins. He says, well, I'm a product of this system and this system helped me get to where I am. These are the inequalities that I see in it, and I'm using my lived experiences to make that better and to, make change about that. But they don't like, at least the way that I view it is they don't use that as kind of a victimization. They use that as a justification for their work versus from the left, they say, well, because my life sucked so much, it's like, well, if your life really sucked that much, like it seems like I mean, really, if you go past it, like whatever you achieved, you shouldn't have achieved if these systems are what they are. And because of the fact that you did achieve, I don't really know where I'm
Yeah.
going with this.
No,
I
I,
might
I
I
I kind
might
of
tailor
generally know
that
what
a
you're
little
saying.
bit,
So I think
but
there's an application to this whole question in was it yesterday? I think I want to say it was Karine Jean-Pierre talking about her outgoing press secretary for Biden, obviously, discussing her experience as press secretary and how she thought it was harder because she was black and I believe she's queer as well. Or at least that's what I got from the Vanity Fair article. And she says a couple of things that I think are kind of interesting, right? She's like, well, my job is more difficult because I'm the first black press secretary and the first queer press secretary. And I'm like, okay, um, is that true? Quite possibly. Yeah. I mean, I can believe that, right? I can believe because, I mean, as many strides as America has made against racism, right? And against general xenophobia, and we have, right? And that is a good thing, despite what some would tell you. I can believe that in some cases that still does set up a wall for some people, right? I don't mean all, I don't even mean most. I mean that there is there are some people for whom that will just automatically discount KJP because she's black.
Hmm.
And the reason you should discount KGP has nothing to do with the fact that she's black. It has to do with a lot of other things that have nothing to do with her race and everything to do with her general ability to be press secretary. So, but she says, I felt like the job was heavier because I felt, oh, what was the quote? I was tweeting about it yesterday about how it's mentally unhealthy, but I felt like I had a greater obligation to those groups from which I come, and that made my job harder. So this is just a really bad, very mentally unhealthy outlook on life, right? This idea that you, if you're a person of color or you're some kind of, or you have some kind of minority status, that your life is not your life, but must also be a protagonist journey for the status of whatever victimized or minority class you happen to be a part of. Um, I would just lightly suggest to you that you don't have to think about that all the time. And I would also further suggest that thinking about that all the time is one, soul crushingly heavy, and two, let's be honest, a very easy way personally to make excuses to yourself about why failures come. I'm not saying KGP is doing that, right? Because I'm not sure if she is, although some things she said might indicate that she might be. But the problem with seeing yourself, right? Like I'm not white. For those of you who are listening on audio, and are surprised, go look at the profile picture. It's for as someone who's not white. I hate that phrasing, but there's a reason for it, right? Um, there's a lot of cultural push to view yourself and your accomplishments through the lens of, oh, look what a minority can do in America. I would maintain, and some of that's coming from conservatives too, right? There are plenty of Republicans who have said there are plenty of people who are Republican or right leaning or conservative who work in news media, who work in politics, who are not white, and they get that pressure too. And my position is, no matter who that comes from, that's really bad because one, it it gives you, it insulates you from seeing yourself as rising and falling on your merits because you can just say, oh, it's because I'm a minority. Not everyone does that. Let's be very clear, but the mental, it gives you the mental leeway to do so, right? And second of all, it creates this idea that your life is, there's now this second obligation. You can't just be a good press secretary. And I say just as if KGP was, which he wasn't, but it is what it is. You can't just
She
be a good
herself
press
views
secretary.
herself as have done her
Right.
job
Yeah.
well.
Right.
Yes.
Right. You can't just be a good black press. You can't just be a good press secretary. Sorry. You must also be a good black person at being a good press secretary, which is supposed to be some kind of proxy for racial progress. And I disagree, to put it nicely, right? I think that's a really toxifying way to view yourself. And I think it's a really toxifying way to view America too, in the sense of the people that you work with and the obstacles that you run into are profound, are placed there not because life is simply hard and that there are many struggles in it for everybody of all colors, but because they're there specifically because of your membership in this identitarian group. I think that's really bad. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, so I came across this piece that you wrote on the Pivot
Oh
by
no.
YB Substack.
Oh,
Hey, you
okay.
sent it to me.
Thank
No,
goodness.
no,
This is something that's new and not like something that was like 3 years ago. That's gonna be like, why'd you say this?
no.
Yeah. Okay.
No. This is your most recent piece. You sent it to me. It's fair game.
Okay.
Yes, the
Yeah.
Pivot by YB Substack.
24
If
hours ago.
folks haven't checked it out, I was actually the first article on there, and Isaac's the second article on there. So Isaac and I currently are the Pivot by YB Substack.
That's
Well,
right.
other than the founder, Casey.
Right. Top
He
two,
technically
top
had
three.
the
Yeah.
very first, but we're the first contrib outside. contributors. I was the
Casey
first
just
one
spikes
talking
this
about
episode because of that.
I was actually
Oh,
talking about the media industry. So, if we want to go back on what we started this conversation with, that's a whole nother conversation we can have another day.
sure.
But yes, that was what my Substack post was about. And then yours was this very long, deep look at the wokeness, the DEI. The article title that y'all ran with was What Winning the quote Wokeness end quote War actually means, with the subtext of embracing American greatness is not a teleological,
Teleological question.
teleological question, is a teleological question, not just a political one. Well, I mess up that word, so tell everybody what
That's
that
right.
big word
We might
means.
as well explain. Yeah, we might as well start there, right? I've used it in a couple pieces. In one outlet, I won't say which one, was like, "Hey, we can't use that in the title," and I'm like, "Why?" And I'm like, "Because readers won't know what it means." And I'm like, "That's not a story about me being smart and my readers being dumb, by the way. That's a story about me using esoteric words because I like esoteric words and struggle with audience analysis." So teleology is the idea of what are things for? What is the purpose of a thing,
Hmm.
right? So when you look at something like church, for example, right, to highlight a debate on the religious right now, is church a social club that has a lot of social benefits and can bring you into community and work alongside other people who share your values? Or is it functioned and was it created for something higher, aka religious purpose? Now, the fact is both of those things are true, right? There's a utilitarian view of church of, yeah, it's a great social club. We can meet people who are like-minded, and if you're a single Christian, you can find other single Christians there, presumably, and hey, that's pretty awesome, right? But then there's the teleological question of what was church designed to do, right? Function, right? So that's what teleology is about. So when we're talking about American greatness, we are talking about the idea that you, in order to, whether it's meritocracy or whether it's just generally rejecting identity politics and victim politics and grievance politics, it's the idea that you should be unapologetic about the things that you are best at. And the way I applied it in the piece was talking about business, right? So when we're talking about a place like ExxonMobil, we use the term, now we all know what it is. What is the teleological purpose of a company like ExxonMobil, right? Is it to advance a green energy agenda that turns out to not be that green, but we explain that in the piece, right? No, the purpose of ExxonMobil is to keep the lights on for people across America, to be the best energy producer in the world. And the great thing about ExxonMobil, at least recently, is that they take that responsibility quite seriously, and many companies do. That's why we talk about that's what the idea of fiduciary duty, right? So that's another term that we talk about in the piece. Fiduciary, what does that mean? Well, in the context of business, it means you act in the best interest, of your shareholders, right? As opposed to being led by like activist demands to like talk about systemic racism and stuff. It's like, dude, you make shoes. Come on, let's make some shoes, right? What's your teleological purpose? To make shoes. So when we're talking about the idea that you should be fundament that, like the way we explain it in the piece, right? What are universities called to do? What are they functioned to do? Teach people, advance higher learning, engage in research, right? Engage in careful, nuanced, academic, rigorous research to understand ourselves and the world around us. That's what universities are supposed to be the best at, and they should never apologize for doing the things that make them the best at that, right? So when pro-Palestine protesters talk about Columbia University, right? Well, it should divest from companies that do business with Israel. What does that really mean? What means that the university is going to have, maybe, is going to have a smaller portfolio, less return, right? And they're going to have less budget to actually do that research and education, which means they're going to be less good at doing the thing that they are fundamentally purposed and functioned to do. So that's what I mean when I say teleological. So winning the wokeness wars was an interesting piece for two reasons. So the main reason is it's talking about the idea of culture war, and the reality is, outside of people who like you and I, we're pretty locked in on this culture war business. There's a lot of people, especially even on the right, especially kind of on the not so Trumpy fans side of the right, that are very skeptical about the term culture war. And in some cases, they just view it very negatively. And my opinion on that, at least in the context of what I do, is you right. It's not to quote Lenin, because that generally doesn't go down super well. But you may not care about the culture war, but the culture war cares about you, right? And the culture war definitely cares about your kids, and it cares about their education, and it cares about their identity. It cares about their sexuality. Unfortunately, right? You can hide. There's a great quote from Lord of the Rings, right? You can box the world. You can box yourself in from the world, but you can never fully box the world out.
Hmm.
That's the reality of culture war. right? So that's kind of the point that I'm making is that we can talk about semantics, right? We can talk about moments when there are excesses in the name of culture war. Like here's an example, right? In talking about the way we talk about wokeness, right? What does the term wokeness mean? Does the term wokeness actually mean anything significant, right? So here's a parallel, right? And I was thinking about this the other day, and it's a little extreme, but it does prove the point. There are some people who believe that everyone who is gay or lesbian or believes themselves to be transgender is a pedophile.
Hmm.
Every single one, right? There are some people, right? That is an opinion that exists in the world, right? Every gay person is a groomer, right? That's incorrect, right? By all meaningful metrics, that is incorrect. There's data to indicate that. You know, people who by their lived experience can demonstrate that that is not correct. It is untrue that everyone who is gay and lesbian and trans is a pedophile. It is verifiably untrue. Does that mean that the term pedophile has no meaning? No, no one would say that. So just because there are people who overdiagnose things as woke, that doesn't make them correct, right? It doesn't. And we can call their BS all day long, happily, right? But it does mean that the term wokeness is real. It doesn't mean that the term has no meaning. It just means that you've misapplied and misdefined it, right? So that's what we talk about with the piece. That's why we talk about the corporate side, because on the corporate side, I mean, like wokeness is very obvious, right? Like when you say that companies should be covering puberty blockers for children as part of their healthcare plan, right? And there's a very prominent org we can talk about, the Human Rights Campaign, that pushes this sort of thing. That is woke, right? And just because there are some people who go overboard with calling people groomers doesn't mean that there isn't actual wokeness, and that some of that is not profoundly disturbing and unconscionable behavior when it comes to the sexualization of children. So it's a defense of the term. It's a defense of the use of the word wokeness. I know people who I respect very, very much who don't like the term wokeness and won't use it. I totally understand, but I disagree. And the piece explains why.
So you talk a little bit about the shareholders versus activists, and it seems to me like this push for DEI, particularly in the corporate space, shareholders, I think, maybe started advocating for it when they saw it impact a bottom line. Do you think that's over? Do you think that, particularly since the Trump election, I think we're about what, like 76, 77 days since he was elected, obviously within the week of his inauguration now, where he can kind of, at least from the government side, actually put these policies into place. Uh, do you think that the Trump election is kind of the result of an overbalance on the corporate side and on the cultural side, saying, hey, actually through our politics, we're going to bring us back to kind of a more equilibrium and a more central space?
Yes, I do think that. So when we're looking at the term DEI, or at least the practice of corporate DEI, especially, there's a very important parsing that we have to do, right? There are two methods to do DEI, right? The first is expanding the class of people who are, whether it's recruitment, hiring, promotion, whatever, what have you, right? One is expanding the amount of people who are under consideration for that, which is generally good, right? That is initially, right? A lot of probably initial workplace diversity programs like race blind hiring, race blind admissions practices. Is it true that under a certain categorization that's DEI? Sure, but that's expanding the amount of people who are being considered for the given practice that you're talking about. The other kind of DEI, which is the thing that the Trump presidency is probably a response to, that's thrown us into imbalance, is when you close or when you narrow the field of people for consideration. So let's take IBM. IBM CEO, there's a great James O'Keefe has the video. You can look it up at Project Veritas, right? Talking Arvind Krishna, IBM CEO, talks about how they're specifically targeting racial groups to advance, right? To promote. If you don't do that, he basically implies that if you're an executive who fails to meet recruitment targets by racial category, right, you miss out on part of your bonus. That is essentially what he implies. And is that true? It's an open question, but it's really concerning, especially considering the Missouri Attorney General literally sued IBM over this, right? This is some When you're talking about we have to recruit specific races for promotion because we have certain goals, DEI goals that we have to meet. That is narrowing the scope of people who are eligible for a given thing, right? A given award, a given track in the company. That's the bad kind of DEI, right? And that is the kind of thing when people who are pro DEI talk about DEI, I think a lot of them are referring to the former, right? when in reality, much of what we are dealing with in the corporate space is the latter. And I think some people who are pro DEI are fully aware that this is a thing and it's an area that they can equivocate on, right? So they go, well, you're not pro DEI, well, you're not pro like racial equality in business because look at these programs that are like colorblind. Aren't you pro meritocracy? And we're like, yes. And they're like, well, then why are you saying you're anti DEI? And the answer is, well, we clearly mean something different, right? Because they're to refer to previous parsing about DEI. So I think yes, Trump is a symptom of that. Trump is things that involve Trump, right? In terms of the American people, are generally symptoms, right? Trump does not exist in and of himself. He can't create cultural trends. He was a response in 2016 to a lot of cultural trends, and the same thing is true now, right? Because it's we could talk about this more if you wanted to, but in terms of having 4 years of Joe Biden as president was like, yeah, that'll bring Trump back real fast. I mean, if you have 4 years of Trump and everything gets, I generally think it's better for the country, right? Than the alternative would be. Doesn't mean good, but better. Sometimes good. And then that happens, and everyone's like, okay, well, we'll try something else now. And then the something else that comes along is Joseph R. Biden. It's like, oh, this can get really bad, really fast. Okay, I don't like that at all. Okay, well, we'll take our chance with this guy again. Guess we'll go for Trump again. I think that's pretty much what happened. So yeah, Trump's electoral victories are definitely symptoms, not causes. So yeah, I think that we are in that balance right now. There are questions about specific businesses, right? Like you mentioned Costco before. Costco is doubling down on DEI, right? Notably, they're not getting rid of DEI. They're being very open and forthright about it. What does that mean? Well, it's a gamble, right? And I would argue, and I said as much in a piece of the Daily Wire, right? Costco's defense of DEI is just an appeal to a cultural zeitgeist that no longer exists, right? Because you can't defend, it's 2025, right? You cannot defend DEI by just saying, well, look, at diversity is generally a good thing and we should all be nice to each other. We've had way too much scrutiny about DEI, and frankly, we've just had way too many straight up bad DEI programs for anyone right of center or even in the center who's scrutinizing this stuff to believe in that. So yeah, I think it's going to rebalance. I think the gutting of discriminatory DEI, right? That was the actual phrase, I believe, from the executive order, right? Discriminatory DEI practices at the federal level is great because we never should have had discriminatory DEI practices to begin with. Um, yeah, I think, but the one thing I'll say about that before we end that bit is, and my friend OJ Aleka at the State Financial Officers Foundation made this point yesterday to me, is we're not just as conservatives, as people who are right of center, as people who want companies to be politically neutral, right? That sort of thing. We're not just anti DEI, right? We're not just anti ESG. We are pro fiduciary duty. We're pro meritocracy. We are pro equality, right? So I think when we go back full circle to the thing we talked about at the beginning of this, right? Do I think the DEI hubbub is going to die down? Sure. But when it does, if we build our movement's identity on just being anti-DEI, we have very little left to give when DEI is no more, right? And so, because a movement that is solely anti-DEI, when you take the DEI away, it's just anti, it's nothing, right? Mm-hmm. So, if we're going to drive forward and huge credit, there are a lot of people in the generally DEI skeptic space that really understand this, right? OJ's great. A lot of people I work with in the corporate finance space are great. David Bonson's great. James Fishback is really, really good. Who really understand this stuff. When the hubbub around DEI dies down, when the hubbub about ESG dies down, and presumably when actual ESG and DEI die down, it is on us to actually offer a positive vision, which is notoriously something that conservatives are not always awesome at selling. We're not always awesome at selling a positive vision because we're just like not like super temperamentally happy people and we just like complaining about stuff. And if you think that's wrong, you can visit a couple
Well, and I
conservative
love that
events and
you
you listen to
bring that
people.
up because, somebody myself who covered the campaign, I think that
Oh
was
yeah.
one of the big criticisms of Kamala Harris that she didn't really have anything she was for. She was just
So
anti-Trump.
depressing. Yeah, I'm
And
I'm not here for that. Like
yeah.
I
And I
I
love
even
that you bring that up
yeah.
because I think conservatives typically are usually the ones in that camp that we
Yeah.
just hate everything. And now the
Yeah.
left was the ones that hated everything. And so I think that's part of the reasons why conservatives won. But
Yeah,
we
I
are
think that's
coming
right.
up on time here. So do you have any kind of final thoughts you want to leave us with? And where can people keep up with what you're doing? I
Yeah.
always love chatting to you both online and off. So I will be keeping
Same. Yeah.
tabs on everything you're doing and keeping track of all the great work that you put out. But where can
I love it.
people follow along with
Yes.
what you're doing?
So I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter. I'm on X at Isaac Willour. We'll drop a link somewhere, I'm sure. The last thing I would say maybe is just because I was reading it today, there's this great quote from G.K. Chesterton, who is a philosopher and writer, right? About the modern kind of reformer goes up to a fence and says, I don't know why it's there, let's get rid of it.
Mm.
And the more sensible kind says, no, you have to understand why it's there first, and then you can get rid of it. So I think there's a lot of energy on the conservatives or kind of right of center side about destroying things, about dismantling things that have been put up that are not good. We have to remember in that nobly intentioned process to not get rid of things like free markets and free enterprise that are really, really quite good. And we have to learn to be discerning, which is the root of all good politics and all good governance.
I love that. Perfect way to end. Thank you again so much for joining me,
Thank
Isaac.
you.